Well, hey there. Welcome to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club. My name is Joshua Johnson. I'm a journalist and host of the upcoming podcast, The Nightlights, which you can find at nightlightshow.com. Before we dive in, the club would like to again thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting today's Good Lit event. And this is going to be a great lit event because I am looking forward to talking about the book, Stamped from the Beginning, presented in a way that history books are rarely seen, but probably should be seen more often. At least one of our guests is a name that you should definitely know. The other is a name you're going to know real well, especially the more we dig into this book. First, let me introduce Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and Joel Christian Gill. They are the authors of Stamped from the Beginning, a graphic history of racist ideas in America. Joel Christian Gill is an award-winning cartoonist and a historian. He is the chair of the Masters of Fine Arts in Visual Narrative program at Boston University. He's also the author of the acclaimed memoir, Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence. It was cited as one of the best graphic novels of 2020 by the New York Times, and it was the winner of the 2021 Cartoonist Studio Prize. Professor Gill, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us today is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of BU's Center for Anti-Racist Research. If you're not familiar with that term, anti-racist, we'll get into that a lot in the hour ahead. Back in 2020, Time magazine named Dr. Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2021, he was awarded the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, what we commonly call the Genius Grant. Dr. Kendi, it's good to see you again. Welcome.
Good to see you. How are you?
I'm very well, and I'm glad to discuss this graphic novel. It explores the history of how racist ideas have shaped American life and what we can learn from the past to build a more equitable, anti-racist future. I've got plenty of questions. I promise I will not spoil the book for those of you who are watching, because I'm really digging it. And I think there's so much in this. I don't want to give the whole thing away. So we'll try to do as much as we can to give you a clear idea of what's in it, but not spoil some of the real deep gems that are in the book. Still, whether you've read the book or not, and whether you read Stamped from the Beginning, the original text that this is based on, you may have some questions either about this text or just about the nature of how we talk about race, racism, anti-racism, and the imagery and ideas underlying all of that. First of all, Professor Kendi, let me begin with you and this idea of being an anti-racist. I think that idea is foundational before we can talk about anything else. We know generally what racism is. I think we know what it is to consider yourself not racist, but you've introduced this idea over the last few years of being anti-racist, not just, I'm a nice person, I'm not a racist, but affirmatively calling yourself anti-racist. What is anti-racism?
Well, I think it's important for us to understand being anti-racist as the actual contrast to being racist. And so if a racist idea suggests, for instance, that a particular racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group, as we document in our book, then anti-racist ideas suggest the very opposite, that the racial groups are equals. If a racist policy is leading to inequity or injustice between racial groups, then what's the opposite of that? A policy that's leading to equity and justice. Or if an individual is upholding a structure of policies that are leading to inequity and injustice, that person is being racist. But if a person is pushing for a structure of policies that's going to lead to equity and justice for all people, then that person is being anti-racist. And so I've been trying to really allow people to recognize that the term not racist has historically been used by people who were being racist to exonerate themselves and even deny the ways in which their ideas and policies are racist, while to be anti-racist in some cases actually to acknowledge those times we're being racist so we can be better, so we can grow.
Professor Gill, this is a graphic novel adaptation of Stamped from the Beginning. Talk about the power of doing this through imagery instead of just through prose. There's a lot of cultural imagery that's referred to in Stamped from the Beginning that I think people will see in a very different way once we read this, but why adapt this into a graphic novel?
Well, comics are a sneaky way to teach people something, right? So when you think about the idea of the shared visual language that we all sort of adhere to, if I were to tell everybody in the audience, anybody watching, to draw a house, everybody draws the same house, right? They draw a square with a rectangle, maybe put some smoke coming out of the chimney. Everybody draws the exact same house. And we do that because of that underpinning that some, Baldo, I think there's a couple of French philosophers called semiotics, right? This language of how the signs and symbols work. And those signs communicate on a subconscious level. So there are often times when you see a character, you pour yourself into it. So it builds a little bit of empathy. I always say comics are empathy machines. So you have some empathy with that character. This is why when we see a smiley face, we recognize it as ourselves as opposed to recognize it as the other. Like the most in 2015, the newest word of the year, the word of the year was the LOL emoji, right? And it was a smiley face. And no one has ever asked for a smiley face, that yellow smiley face, to be the color of their skin, because we all recognize that it's a abstraction of what we are. So drawing comics to tell these stories does something that prose alone doesn't. First, it reaches a large amount of people. It reaches a much broader amount of people who may not pick up a 579-page history tome, but would read a comic, right? For example, my grandmother, who passed away last year at the age of 90, I don't think she ever read novels, but I'm sure she read comics. She read my comics at least. And if she were still here, she would be reading this book right now while she was taking her dialysis, right? So I think that's what I think connects us to those things. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that I think I was a teenager before I realized Charlie Brown was white. And it was because of that simplicity of who he is and how he's drawn. He's basically a smiley face. And because of that, we pour ourselves into him, and it creates empathy. And we know that it's creating empathy, and we can tell because they keep banning them.
As we get into this book, Professor Gill, I just want to pick up on one thing that you were getting at in terms of these cultural images. I think that another value of this as a graphic novel, at least from reading the book, is that so many of these images, like you said, like Charlie Brown, are just kind of so ingrained culturally, we think nothing of them. They just kind of are there. They're just kind of the background noise of life. And because they're so ubiquitous, we never take a moment to go, what is that? Where did that come from? We don't even know how to look underneath the surface, because I think a lot of these people may not even know what to look at. And this gives us a chance to sort of look behind the images we've taken for granted for so long. Am I hearing you right, Professor Gill?
Yeah, and I think that those images, have ability to communicate in ways that we don't necessarily think about. The best comics, when you read the best comics, you don't think I'm looking at pictures, I'm reading words, right? You're absorbing it all at the same time. No one's ever stopped and thought, oh, I'm reading a comic, right? Because if you do that, then you failed at making comics. Like at that point, you're no longer making comics, you're making, prose, or you're drawing pretty pictures. And I think the best comics sort of combine those things so that you're no longer thinking about them. So when reading those, you're absorbing things. So those images are creating, like, this is when you write, you are entering into a contract with somebody who else is the reader, right? You're giving them some information, and you're not making them dumb, right? Or acting like they're dumb. So with comics, it's a little bit step further, right? Because I need Joshua Johnson to take what happens in the gutter between panels and fill in that space. And because of that active participation that you take, it's more ingrained, it's more powerful, you feel it a little bit more.
Before I go back to Professor Kendi, you used an art term, gutter. Define that term, what you mean, just so people understand what you meant.
That's the space between the two panels. So between each panel, there's a gutter, and that's the space. I actually call my classroom at BU the gutter, because that's where the magic happens. So
okay,
Josh, I've been learning all these terms too.
Okay, I just didn't want people thinking, what's Joshua Johnson doing in that gutter? Come out of the gutter. That's not what the brother's saying. Speaking of terminology, I should just say, just so that we're all on the same page, because there's lots of different people from many different walks of life and many different sensitivity levels. This conversation is going to deal with themes of race and racism in very candid and very honest and historically accurate ways. That may include the usage of the so-called N-word. I am not going to censor our guests today, but I think it's fair to let you know, you watching, that we are having an unfettered conversation about race and racism in America. Something to think about if there are children within earshot and you want to be mindful in terms of how you have this conversation with them. But we are going to have an unvarnished conversation about these things. And I think that's part of the beauty of the book, Professor Kendi, including just the title, Stamped from the Beginning. Early in the book, you get into a lot of historical depictions of many, many historical figures, including Jefferson Davis, the so-called president of the Confederacy. Talk about that idea, stamped from the beginning, and why that is a strong enough idea to be the title of the book.
Well, Jefferson Davis, as you stated, would become the president of the Confederate States of America. Before that, he was a senator from Mississippi and a major enslaver, and he was a major defender of slavery, and he was also an articulator of racist ideas in the floor of the U.S. Senate. To give an example, in 1860. His fellow senators were considering a bill that would have provided funding to educate Black people in Washington, D.C. He rose up in opposition to that bill. And in his opposing speech, he said the inequality between the Black and white races was stamped from the beginning. And in many ways, as we show in this book, that racist ideas were stamped from the beginning of the United States, indeed of British colonial America, and we document the history across time.
Just looking at the artwork from here, and I'm digging the artwork. This is such a beautifully drawn book, and it's also fun to read. It's not a drag. It's a really engrossing read. But the quote that you put from him is, the inequality of the white and Black races was stamped from the beginning. Racial inequality is the will of God, as marked in decree and prophecy, as confirmed by history. Professor Kendi, one of the big themes of the book is that racism was not just viewed as, well, I don't like those people, and that's the way it is. There were many different ways in which racists justified racism and called it faith and called it science and called it law, but wrapped this logical framework around virulent racism as a way to kind of make it seem like, oh yeah, this is the only way it could possibly be.
Indeed, and before the Civil War, one of the leading secular theories articulating Black inferiority was what was known as polygenesis. It was this theory that each race was created separately. Each race had its own creation story. It suggested that, at least in the biblical sense, we were not all descendants of a white Adam and Eve, as other racist theorists who were monogenicists made the case. And so polygenicists, like Jefferson Davis, typically made the case that Black people were created before Adam and Eve, when the animals were created. And indeed, in his speech, in which he said the inequality of the white and Black races was stamped from the beginning, he would then go on the floor of the US Senate to make a case for how and why Black people were created with the animals.
Can I just camp out on that for a second? When I read that in the book, I was like, what? I'm sorry, what? There's one Adam and Eve for white folks, and we just kind of came out the lab. We were just an experiment, like pre-release. It's just so wild. The depths of the ways in which racism was justified. And Professor Gill, your task in putting this book together was finding ways to articulate it, I think, without caricaturing it every time. I mean, some of them are just straight up like caricatures because the ideas are insane. But there's also a visual language to the book. Even the way that the speech bubbles are colored and shaded. Some of them are in regular clear text. Some of them almost have like a black background that looks like it's dripping. Like you had to, like, just to show the rottedness of these ideas. Talk about how you came up with the visual subtext, the visual language of this book.
Yeah, I mean, when it wasn't just like me reading the book and sort of adding to it. Like, I went back and read the congressional record in which Jefferson Davis actually said this, which is actually bananas. But going through this whole thing, I was wanting to make sure that, because comic speaks in that language that I was talking about, right? So comic speaks in this language that I wanted people to immediately teach you how to read this in the first, couple of chapters, so that when you saw icons or you saw imagery or you saw things that were popped out, you knew that this was something that was important. And so early on, it was immediately one of the ideas that I had, because those racist ideas are so prevalent. I mean, there's, like that idea that, Black people are stamped from the beginning as inferior is still a common thing, right? Like, you hear, as Paul Fierley talked about, these sub-oppressors actually saying it, like Tim Scott, right? These sub-oppressors who go out to the world and say, well, you're not oppressed because they've gotten some power, so they come out. But those ideas are still out there, right? That you're making some decisions. So I wanted to make sure that we always kept, yeah, I wanted you to be able to open up a page and go, oh, there's a racist idea, there's a racist idea, there's a racist idea, and see how prevalent. And especially when, that even some, W.E.B. Du Bois says racist ideas. There are other people who we actually, profoundly think are, and, like we hold a high esteem of, right? Who actually create racist ideas. And I think it is an indication or an indictment of the system that we all hold racist ideas. And I think in order to, it's almost like that Catholic idea, like in order to be a good person, you have to practice being good, right? And it's the exact same thing. When thinking about anti-racist ideas, you have to fight against all of those things. We've been taught those things, all those racist ideas throughout history in society, from the time we were, in third grade to, in kindergarten until, now. Like, you got to look back at these things and go, these are racist ideas. And so I wanted to pinpoint those, and it's almost like sticking a pin in it, right? I wanted people to be able to look at that and go, oh, that's a racist idea. This is a racist idea. And I think that's the beauty of what comics does, is that it takes that information and it encapsulates it in a way that you automatically see it. Like, once you see that one time, you don't have to think to yourself, oh, this must be a racist idea. You just know it is. And I think that's what I'm trying to do when I'm talking about those things, and sort of dig into some of the history as well.
We are speaking to Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and Boston University Professor Joel Christian Gill, both of Boston University. Their new book is called Stamped from the Beginning, A Graphic History of Racist Ideas in America. Happy to take your questions and thoughts and stories about racism, racist ideas, or how we have the conversation about race in American culture today. It's not identical to what's happened in the past, but it sure does rhyme. And one of the things that comes out in this book are all the rhyming moments from some of the things we see today and many of the things we've seen in the past. Before I come back to you, Professor Kendi, I want to get into the structure of the 5 historical figures that you chose to focus this book around. Some people may know, some, at least I did not know until I had read this book. But I just want to camp out on the introduction for just a second, because it's a really, like, you got an attitude. You know that? You got an attitude. And it pop out from page 1. I'm going to try to do a dramatic reenactment of the introduction. It's like you're looking at a TV and there's an image of a white woman being held aloft on the shoulders of a group of young Black people. And then you see the text of the announcer's voiceover. And the voiceover reads, "We now return to today's after-school special, Beauty Among the Beasts, the heartwarming story of Karen White, played by Cassie Blanca, a beautiful young woman who saves a group of poor Black ghetto kids, co-starring Gary Coleman as the cute and sassy Sam's Little, brought to you by Citizens for Law and Order to re-elect Ronald Reagan, and Sugary Sugar Spokes, part of a complete breakfast." That's page 1. And I'm reading it, I'm like, what part of the game is this? What is this about to be? I wonder, Dr. Kendi, how you two had the conversation about the tone of the book. Because you're right, Professor Gill. Like, I think if you show somebody like this much book and say, educate yourself, they're going to be like, maybe another time, and back off. This was I was not ready for this to be the beginning of the book. I, as a Black person, expected the book to be a little bit more serious, but the humor in it, I was like, okay, I don't exactly know what this book is going to be, but I'm down for it, whatever it's about to be. Talk about what you've learned over the years, Professor Kendi, in terms of tone and style when you talk about things that are as big and scary as racism and race.
Well, first, let me just say that I think the humor, in many ways, the critical humor is one of the beautiful elements, of the book that I think, Joel was able to introduce, is sort of a master class of finding that balance between sort of humor and sort of a criticality and even storytelling. But I've learned over the years that human beings are human, right? So we need a variety of emotions no matter what we're talking about, right? And even if we're talking about a heavy subject like the history of racist ideas, yes, people recognize its heaviness, but they need some lightness in parts of it, if not most of it, and that's a way in which they can get through the heaviness. And so, in many ways, the lightness, the humor, becomes almost like the road for people to get through this history, and learn from it and be engrossed by it.
You tell this story through 5 historical figures: Cotton Mather, Thomas Jefferson, William Lloyd Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Angela Davis. Why did you pick those 5? Let's just start with Cotton Mather. Why him? Why is he the first figure that you wanted us to see this story through?
Well, Cotton Mather lived from the 1660s in Boston to about the 1720s. And during that period, really, which was obviously the colonial era, theologians really dominated science, or quote, intellectual activity. And so the principal thinkers were theologians, and he was the most influential American theologian during the colonial era, particularly during that era. And he also wrote on and spoke about slavery and race. And so he was at the center of some of the most important early debates about race. So I thought it was important to place him, as a character, since he was at the center of these early debates that we were going to portray.
He also, you and you, Professor Gill, as well, go to some lengths to portray him as something of a golden child, a guy who believed very much that he was sort of imbued by God to say the things that he was saying with a sort of a righteous religiosity that was just bulletproof. And because there was no real movement to meet that belief system, that was just kind of understood and accepted. There was no kind of way to give pushback for that. Am I kind of hearing his story right?
Yeah, I mean, in every era of history, there was always people who were opposing views, who were saying things that were the opposite of what these people were saying. This is why that whole argument of like, you can't criticize people because they were people of their time, when there's always somebody in that time who's, waving the banner of like, this is wrong. But it's not unlike, I mean, Cotton Mather was what's the guy from the 700 Club that just died? He was that guy of his age, right?
Pat Robertson.
Pat Robertson. He was Pat Robertson, right? He was Pat Robertson, Joel Osteen. He was, T.D. Jakes. He was like that guy, right? Of the time. So, and he would just say stuff, right? And because you're in this position of power, and most people were as uneducated, it just sounded like he would just make stuff up, like the Negro Christianized, right? Like this whole thing is just like made up of whole cloth, like everything's made up. But at the same time, like he's just making up these random things. And so, of course, a life of privilege that he had, geared with the way in which he was raised, like the foundational ideas of Princeton, Brown, Harvard, and Yale are racist ideas. And until we sort of dismantle those, in a lot of ways, the same way people are dismantling the church as deconstructing the church as well. But until we start dealing with that, those ideas are going to keep coming up. And so, yeah, Cotton Mather was, the forefront. They were the forefront of thought, right? Most of the time when we talk about that period in time, those people are the ones that dominate. And I think Cotton Mather thought he walked on water, right? He was told that, he was told that he is the chosen one. He was the youngest person to go to Harvard. He was of these like his family founded Harvard. Like he is like the worst rich kid you could think about, right? Like think about that kid in class, right? That was like, my dad gave the money for the college, right? He is that kid, like times 10.
I hear what you're saying in terms of him being able to imbue these ideas into these institutions from their inception. I think that's what we mean when you hear something like this institution was founded on racist ideas. That's not a dig. Like, you can point to the founders and the ideas and draw a very direct connection, which Professor Kendi continues, I think, to take shape in the second section about Thomas Jefferson, because that begins to get into the Enlightenment, the expansion of science as a means for making life and governmental decisions. And you point to a number of the areas in which the sciences are used in new ways to justify these ideas, including some scientists who are foundational in our understanding of everything. I mean, Carl Linnaeus, who formed our system of like naming animals, calling something like a Homo sapiens or, feline domesticus for the house cat or whatever the name is. Even he created these hierarchies of different races that are not based in what we now understand about genetics. So we kind of went from this religious bases to, when science rose, it immediately applied to these racist beliefs as well.
Indeed. And if Cotton Mather made the case that though we may be different in body, in other words, Black people are physically inferior and worthy of enslavement because they have a distinct body, we are all equal in soul, and all souls are white. So Black people should be ministered to. And he challenged enslavers who said no. But to your point, by the 1700s, particularly by the mid 1700s, that of course was the age of this European Enlightenment. And of course, Enlightenment thinkers like Linnaeus and even American thinkers who were inspired by them, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were one of their primary intellectual activities was classifying the entire world. But most specifically classifying humanity. And so it was during this period that the quote, Black African, white European, red American, and yellow Asian, emerged. And not only those racial classifications became hardened, but there was also characteristics Linnaeus attached to Black people, particularly inferior characteristics relative to white people. And those characteristics were later articulated by Thomas Jefferson.
And I just want to be clear for the people in back who may not have caught it. This was entirely made up. This was science that was made to fit the theory or fit the dogma, not science that emerged like, see, we proved this thing. We knew we were right all along. Like, some of this was just whole cloth, right?
Well, you had people like Linnaeus and others who were classifying human beings in Africa and Asia and the Americas, and they had never been to Africa, Asia, or the Americas, or they were classifying them from a European perspective, right? Or they were classifying them to justify colonialism, to justify this idea that Europeans were bringing, quote, civilization and Christianity to these inferior barbaric peoples, which of course, and so I think it's important, it's important to recognize the relationship between Enlightenment thinkers creating this massive hierarchy, human hierarchy, and European explorers and settler colonialists subjugating peoples of color, particularly in this case, Black people.
I think it's also really important to think about it in terms of this is they were taking these ideas and they were basically applying stupid logic to the things. Well, if this is this, then this must be this, right? So if we have gunpowder and giant ships, then those people in Africa with their, different ways of living must be inferior because of that. And then you add on to that the monetary gain of capitalism, and then it becomes like we have to so these people are saying it's almost like I'm going to come up with an idea, and then the capitalist is like, I think that's a really good idea to use this so that I don't feel bad, or that I can use this to make the argument that I could subjugate a person. And I think that continue those ideas, those continuing ideas, the idea that we should administer to Black people's soul is no different than people saying, why don't you just be American? Don't be black. I'll just be American, right? It's those same sort of ideas that just regurgitated and changed over time.
That also comes up in some of the early stories where there is this mix of, and this, I have to admit, like, one of the things that I took from this book was having a more nuanced view of some of the Black luminaries that I grew up knowing. Like, I knew about the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, who's one of the 5 kind of keystone figures you tell the story through. And I knew about his idea of the talented 10th. But I think it's also helpful to see the real nuance in how even some of, like, the names that I had to know for the Black History Month quiz every February had a mix of ideas that we now would call anti-racist and others that were more assimilationist, where it was like, Black people who are luminaries saying, we can aspire to be like whites. I mean, you tell the story of Phyllis Wheatley. It was a slave girl who wrote poetry, and there was a trial to determine, did she actually write this? And sure enough, she did. But you include some of the lines in there that clearly have these assimilationist ideas. For example, on page 63, you quote one of her poems, which reads, "Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, C-A-I-N, Cain and Abel. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." Professor Kendi, before I get to some questions from our audience, talk about that, about the interlocking nature of anti-racist and assimilationist, or anti-racist and various kind of appeasing ideas. It was never cut and dried from the very beginning.
It wasn't, and this is the reason why this is a book about ideas, and knowing that the same person can hold conflicting ideas. The same person can hold racist and anti-racist, or assimilationist and anti-racist ideas. But I think to explain the distinction between segregationist and assimilationist and anti-racist ideas, which we document this almost 3-way debate, is segregationists and assimilationists both conceived of whiteness or white people as the standard. And segregationists would make the case that Black people are incapable of becoming white, thereby civilized, thereby human. Assimilationists were like, no, Black people are capable of becoming white, of being refined, of being developed, of being civilized. And anti-racists were like, wait, we shouldn't have a single standard that all humans should quote aspire to be, that we should have multiple ways of being in the world. So anti-racists would say that Black people aren't just created equal, they are equal. And so that's the sort of 3-way debate. And so you had assimilationists who were even Black, who internalized the idea of white people as being the sort of norm or the standard, and then they attempted to be just like white people and made the case that Black people were capable. So like in the case of the Talented 10th essay by W. Du Bois, in that essay, he argued that a certain segment of Black people have assumed the best of European civilization, and we are the talented 10th. And I think that's an indicative, that's an example of, we are talented because we have done what Europeans have done, as opposed to we are just as talented as any other group because we're just as human.
You could also call that like W.E.B. Du Bois's pound cake lecture.
Yeah. There's a little Bill Cosby caricature in here at the top that I was like, ooh, that might be too soon. That still hurts. Regarding the nature of the book, let me get to some questions from our viewers. Again, thanks to those of you who have sent questions in. They're great. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can in the time we have left. One person asked, and maybe Professor Gill, you could start with this one. Can you talk about the collaboration process between the two of you while working on this book? Were there times of disagreement or conflict, and how did you overcome them? Professor Gill?
I don't think there was any conflict. Dr. Kendi was gracious to just like what I say a lot of the times, and I think this is the best way to describe it, is like for me to thank Dr. Kendi for letting me put fart jokes in his history tome, because for the most part, like if they're like, for example, I'll just give one really good example. When writing about Dr. King, when we got to the March on Washington, I was drawing this panel that's Martin Luther King's given his I Have a Dream speech. And he says, I have a dream that one day white girls will post a picture of me on their Instagram, or I have a dream that conservative politicians will misquote me in order to win political arguments. And at whatever happened, like the universe kismet, at the same time, Dr. Kendi had just written in the Atlantic a situation about the misrepresentation of Dr. King. And so like I texted him that image that I had drawn. And it's just like this weird thing that was happening. So for the most part, he gave me the free reign to go and do things. And if there was something that was like over the top, because I am over the top, I'm a troll, like I admit it. We talked about it, but it wasn't like I wasn't like like there's a line. The only line in the sand that I drew ever in this whole process was the Force Ghost jokes that I put in there. Because they're Force Ghosts. Whenever anybody comes back, I make them a Force Ghost. So like it's like, thanks, Force Ghost Martin Luther King, or thanks, Force Ghost Leo the African.
You mean like they have that aura around them, and
Yeah,
some of
so
them
they're
have
like a little
chains like Jacob Marley, and yeah.
Yeah, so like that, I think that's the only one that I'm like, let's keep that one, please. But for the most part, it was just I tried to be as accurate as I possibly could. So like legitimately copying and pasting from the book in places so that I could get the text. But when it came to like writing the dialogue and the jokes and stuff, I had free range, which was incredible. It's unlike any
You
other
also,
process that I could I've worked with art writers before, and this is so much better than any other process.
let me stick with you, Professor Gill. Someone else asked, can you talk a bit about how you got into drawing or being a cartoonist? How did you study and perfect your craft?
I didn't perfect my craft. I am perfecting my craft as we go along. Like if you stop learning, then you stop growing. I got my MFA in painting. But as a kid, I wanted to be a cartoonist. I always tell people that comics was the thing. Comics was my high school girlfriend. We spent every day together. We were gonna make beautiful children together. And then I went away to college. And went away to college, and I fell in love with painting. And then like I left my college girlfriend. I fell in love with painting. We had a couple of kids. It didn't work out. And then one day in a coffee shop, I saw comics again, and we've been happily married ever since. That's the way I describe it. But so comics was the thing that I wanted to do, and but ultimately I am a storyteller, and so when my paintings were failing to tell stories, I went back to the idea of drawing comics, and for that, what I did was I got myself a library degree in comics, and a library degree is when you have a library card and a will, and I just went and learned everything I could, read the entire canon, and just practiced it. So if anybody out there who wants to be a cartoonist, there's a lot of ways to do it. The first thing is to start drawing comics. There's nobody stopping you from doing that.
Or you can go study with Joel at BU.
You could indeed. Professor Kendi, let me put the next question to you. One of our viewers writes, I'm a white millennial man who lives in the Bay Area. It's been difficult to speak with older white generations of the urgency around our world today. What are some strategies to convey this urgency? If I may just add on to the question, I wonder if part of the challenge is imbued in some of the cultural images that you deal with. You talk in the book about things like Tarzan and Planet of the Apes and other stories that are so much a part of our cultural canon that have these really intense racial underpinnings. And I think once you reach a certain point, and again, I'm saying this as a person who's not in these generations, it can be harder to kind of keep looking back and go, wait, I lived my entire life with no problem with this whole thing. And now you're telling me I've spent 70 years, 80 years supporting something that was racist from the beginning, la, la, la. And it's just hard to hear. I wonder if maybe generationally it's a process of giving people permission to look behind the curtain and see a man when they spent their whole life just thinking it's the wizard.
Indeed, and so I would really try to meet. This is for anyone, but certainly we're talking about older people. I'd try to really meet them where they are. I'd really try to figure out what are the issues in society that they personally are passionate about, or even what are the problems they are angry about, and not the made up ones, right, but the real ones, right? And just you have to sort of distinguish, because you have people who are who are actively seeking to conserve racism by making up problems and distracting people. But I suspect there are real issues that they're concerned about. And learning those and thinking about those, it's likely there are some racial or racist elements to those problems that you could essentially guide them to. So you're meeting them where they are. They're talking about an issue they're already passionate about, and now they can see the ways in which racist policies or even ideas have actually led to or reinforced the very problem that they recognize and that they are outraged about. So it's just so important.
Can you give me an example of that?
So let's say, for instance, they are enraged about the climate crisis. And in their mind, this is the climate crisis. There's no racial quote unquote element to it. There's two ways to do it. There's to talk about how the very elected officials who are denying the climate crisis and therefore refusing to make significant changes because of those denials are the very elected officials who are likely denying racism. It's the same group, right? Or the ways in which the people who have been elected into those positions to deny the climate crisis and not move on it were typically elected through racist ideas, through manipulating people into believing that people of color were the problem. So that's just one example.
I can give another example because I think this is one that we hear a lot of, which is black on black crime. Most criminologists and sociologists agree that crime is an opportunity situation. It is because of proximity, right? It's because you're in a neighborhood with it. So most crime among black people happens among black people. Most crime against white people happens amongst white people. Why do we still have proximity crime for black people and white people? It's because of segregation. So pointing out this idea that all black people still live in a predominantly one place and all white people still live in a predominantly one place is an indication of the structural systems that put us in those places in the first place, which perpetuates these ideas. Right. And so people forget. So when you hear these people yelling about what about black on black crime, say, yeah, black on black crime is about proximity. Right. And because most crime is based on where you live, then you're actually pointing out structural racism when you point out black on black crime.
Let me get to a few more questions in the time we have. I want to make sure we get to this one, particularly because of what's been going on with educational policy in the last few years. Professor Gill, maybe you start with this one, and then Professor Kendi, I'll let you jump in. The viewer asks, I'm grateful there are academics like you releasing more books and resources to address the issues of racism with children. How else can we address the issues of racism with children? Professor Gill, let's hear from you, and then Dr. Kendi.
Well, there's a book called How to Raise an Anti-Racist that you could look at. There are having difficult conversations with children, specifically. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that a lot of the things, which is a fascist talking point about like protecting the children, it becomes one of those, it's in the list of fascist talking points, right? We have to protect the children. We're considering protecting white children from feeling uncomfortable about the connection with those people who did these things and the colonial human traffickers, like those types of individuals, right? Well, why would you want your child to be connected to that because the only way to connect through that is whiteness. And when children take up the mantle, when there are white people and then there are people who happen to be white, and when they pick up that mantle of whiteness and connect themselves through history, through culture, through anything else with those individuals, that's when they're going to feel bad. So there's part of this is don't teach especially little kids not to connect themselves to this idea, because the idea of whiteness is different from the idea of blackness. Blackness was forced upon us, e pluribus unum, right? Out of many one. Black people were many different peoples forced into one category. White people in America there is no real white people, and the only way you have that is in opposition to black people. Because when you take poor white people and you put them in a place where there's predominantly white people, the aristocracy sort of do the exact same thing to those poor white people that they would do to poor black people. So there's no connection. There's no sort of community that's created because of that whiteness. And so first of all, I would say disconnect yourself from the idea of whiteness. Like tell kids like, yeah, you happen to be white and you recognize that there are privileges in that, but you are not those people. And because those people are white does not mean that you are them. Number two, in order to understand how our history works, we have to understand where it came from. And by constantly arguing that we shouldn't talk about it just means that we won't be talking about it and we won't fix those problems. And I think that's really important. And read How to Raise an Anti-Racist.
Professor Kendi, before you answer, I feel like one of the benefits of talking to children about racism is children are very receptive to stories. And I think the story of America, if you lay it out right, a child's mind can just grasp it and it'll click. Like you have characters who are in a conflict that can explain that there are people who are trying to help one another. I mean, we teach through narrative. It's Sesame Street, right? You set up a situation and you impart a value. I think what scares a lot of parents is what happens when the story is over and your kid is laying in bed. And, I've had conversations with white parents about this too, in terms of talking about racism, where they're afraid that their kid is going to run into their bedroom and say, Mommy, I had a nightmare that I hurt my Black friend. And the parent is ill-equipped, right? They're afraid to be in that moment alone when your book is not at their bedside or where their friend who's willing to talk about this is not there. And all of a sudden, in an instant, they have to walk their children through an adaptation that they are still adapting to themselves. How do they deal with that?
I'm happy you mentioned that because it is a difficult process to ideally ensure that our children are learning racist ideas, I should say learning anti-racist ideas. At the same time, we're unlearning racist ideas. So like it's a hard thing to navigate, as a parent, but it's possible, right? Because the more we teach them anti-racist ideas, the more we learn them ourselves. But what we're also speaking to is us as adults recognizing how hard it is to unlearn racist ideas. And for us to say, you know what, I don't want my kid to wake up when they're 30 or 50 or 70 and be like, whoa, like, how did I ever come to think this way about other groups of people? And it's so hard to not think this way. I've been trying for years. No, I want my child to not have to go through that struggle. But to the question, the only thing I would also add is really navigating the child through experiences. So navigating the child to different cultural spaces so they can see different cultural groups and see that different cultural groups as equals, allowing them to go to a food pantry and talk to them about why is it, if this is the case, that the people who are coming here are disproportionately people of color, and explain to them, because they're likely to ask, that it's not because there's something wrong with them. There are larger rules that are leading to this. So I think we have to take our children out into the world so that they can experience things, so they can ask questions, so we can be prepared to have those conversations. So we're not literally lecturing them all the time. And typically, I know when my 7-year-old asks questions, that's when she's most likely to listen to my answer.
When the question comes from her. Before I get to our next few questions, I know we've got just a few minutes left. It sounds like, Professor Kendi, that we need to give ourselves a little grace in terms of how we deal with this and just allow it to be hard. Just acknowledge that it is difficult and do it anyway and give ourselves some grace to deal with the difficulty.
I mean, Joel mentioned my book, How to Raise an Anti-Racist. That was one of the themes. I consistently and constantly talked about my struggles doing this with my daughter, despite all my training, and expertise. So if it's a struggle for me, I know it's going to be a struggle, for everyone, because this is hard work. But we have to do it to protect our children.
Let me stick with you, Dr. Kendi. Another question from one of our viewers. Was there any image that Joel drew that particularly moved you or surprised you on how it was interpreted?
So there were numerous images that moved me. And And I'll just mention one, since we already talked about it, was that the opening image, of the of the image of quote Karen White, which I think is extremely relevant, to our time, because, and I think that's one of the beauties of comics, let me just say, and I'm almost jealous of Joel, because he can tell whole stories through an image, right? We as writers, we have to write a whole paragraph or a whole chapter, when just the term Karen White says all that needs to be said.
We are winding down. I do want to get to one or two more questions if I can. I will plant the seed for our last question. It's traditional for the Commonwealth Club to ask speakers what their 60-second idea is to change the world. So I'll let you percolate on that in the background as I ask one more question, starting with you, Professor Gill. The viewer asked, what is the best piece of advice that you've received, either personally or professionally? Professor Gill?
Personally or professionally, be kind to yourself. I think don't give the world the responsibility of being kind to you. We're often really hard on ourselves, just artists and people in general. We are very self-critical. And somebody told me once that if you don't take care of yourself, treat yourself like a 3-year-old in a lot of ways. Like if a 3-year-old made a mistake, you wouldn't start cursing at them and calling them an idiot. You'd be like, that's okay, baby. Let's do it next time, right? And I think that's what you have to do for yourself, because we often spend too much time being critical of ourselves. And I think it's really important, especially artists and creatives of any sort. You have to be kind to yourself.
That's got to be hard though, as a creative. I know, just as someone who works in a different kind of creative profession, that does not come natural.
Being critical is not the same as not being kind, right? Like it's just not, they are not the same thing. And I think we have the idea that critical means to be negative, but it doesn't. For example, if I had a booger on my nose and I said, how do I look today? You would say, you need to blow your nose. Right? That's being critical. You criticized the way I looked. You gave me some opinions on how to fix it, and I fixed it, and I moved forward going out into the world. That's how all criticism should be. It should be about helping somebody be better. It's not just about hearing yourself talk or tearing somebody else down. And then you should do that to yourself too. When you're self-critical, it should be how do I make these hands better? How do I make this composition better? Not this composition is trash, I should just go throw myself away. It's not like that. It's more about like how you take care of yourself.
Professor Kendi, what about you? Best piece of advice you've received, either personally or professionally?
I think that finding a balance between humility and confidence has been probably the best piece of advice. And so I think what that means, and this adds to Joel's point, to even when you achieve or you're successful, you don't necessarily gloat or think that you're the best thing since sliced bread. You approach success with a level of humility, and you approach failure with confidence that, okay, this is a single act. I'm going to keep striving. I'm going to keep growing. And I think both that sort of humble confidence allows us to both succeed and fail with grace.
Another viewer asks, thank you so much for this discussion. Taking into account the divisive world we live in today, how do you hope we carry your book's findings forward to meaningfully enact change? Professor Kendi, how would you answer that?
I would really just say there are, despite the divisiveness, there are a number of people who are serious, who are open-minded, and who are serious about understanding their world, understanding their history, transforming this society. And so, and that even includes people who are open-minded, but they have different viewpoints. So to me, it's really introducing the book to open-minded people, whether they agree with you, or not, and allowing the magic of the book to its empathy machine, as Joe calls it, to do its work.
Professor Gill, what about you?
This ties into the 60-second, how do I change the world? I think stories are important. When a civilization is gone and we unearth the civilization, what we find are their stories, their art and their stories. And that's what we have to carry them. When you have a conversation with you and one other person, what you exchange are stories, where you grew up, how you live, what you like, with that television show, all of those things, you exchange those stories. Stories are, I believe, are the building blocks of humanity. And I think that those little bits and pieces that we share with each other over a cup of coffee in a bar or just standing in the line at the DMV, those little bits and pieces of humanity actually build empathy. And I think when we are more empathetic to other people and understanding where they come from and where they are, which is what Dr. Kendi says, meeting people where they are, meeting people where they are. And I think, the original translation of what the golden rule is, that what we get it wrong. We always say, do unto others as you should have others do unto you. And I'm not religious, but the original translation is do unto others as they would have them done unto themselves, right? And understanding that moving forward. So meeting someone where they are, sharing those personal stories, and studies have shown that personal stories actually change more opinions than facts and figures. If you are somebody who is queer and you run across somebody who is like anti, if you have a personal story and conversation with them on a less heated level, you can actually change their mind. I mean, we've all had those people in our lives that were devout racist until they met that guy at work who helped them, or like any other thing, right? Any other of those isms, right? And I think that's important to rebuild empathy and to build that empathy one person at a time. Sometimes, like I'm a macro level, I'm a troll, right? I'm going to make people angry, but on a micro level, I'm going to talk to people and I'm going to have a conversation so that I can teach people so I can teach them and share that story. And when all else fails, hug people, because hugging people always helps.
Now, see, you keep describing yourself as a troll, and my brain was like, "Oh no, he's not. Look at this book; it's so wonderful." And then the other half of my brain was like, "You just met this brother. You haven't seen him on Twitter. Just like take his word for it. Just accept what he said and let it be what it is." We got 5 minutes left. I want to get to two more quick questions. I know you just gave your 60-second idea, Professor Gill. Professor Kendi, one more question for you. There are so many loud talking heads out there perpetuating the ideas of racism. Is there someone in particular that you would want to send this book to?
I'm laughing because I have some ideas.
Hold it. This is Professor Kendi, because I know you got ideas. That's why I asked him. Professor Kendi, who would you want to send this book to?
So it's a hard question for me to answer because I would want it to send it to someone who is loud and indeed racist, but also maybe open-minded so that they will truly read it and reflect on it. And I think the problem is most of these loud folks, they know they're wrong. They're propagandists. And so I say that almost to dodge the question because no one is coming to mind. I don't know if Joe,
No, I hear
Joe,
that.
does
I hear that.
somebody
I mean,
came to mind?
most of my ideas are just like trolling ideas. Like I would love John McWhorter to read the book. I think John
See, I
McWhorter.
knew. I knew that's why I put it to Professor Kendi, because I was like, okay, I know where this is gonna go.
I mean, there are a few people who I think, like in meeting, and maybe even politicians, meeting them on a one-on-one level, as opposed to what they do on television is completely different than when you meet them on a one-on-one level. But I think that there are people who I think would read it and have some understanding. But they won't. But the current climate won't allow them to say that. And I'm not talking about, and there are a lot of Black conservatives that I wish would read this book. But the problem with a lot of those Black conservatives, not the people who have come to these ideas through different means, as opposed to just basically reappropriation, becoming sub-oppressors like Clarence Thomas or Candace Owens or any of these other people who basically deny. But there are some people who, there's a guy whose name I can't remember right now, but I would consider like that's somebody who I think could who I think should read it. And I can't think of his name, so it's kind of pointless. But there are people that you want to be sort of like Dr. Kendi said, like open-minded. But the problem is that the people who and I guess it would mostly be regular people that would be like the ones that are open-minded, that are not
Right.
entrenched in those ideas and don't have the power, they're not beholden to this power structure that they have to hold up, right? Because if, Candace Owen wrote this book and changed her mind, like she would lose her entire base. She would lose all of her money, right? If, that woman from the PragerU were to read this book, she would also lose, like all of these people, these conservative, grifters, if they were to read it, they would lose something. So it's more about like that. And it's like your cousin who is like, I don't know, like that sort of makes sense. Like give him that book, right?
Right.
Like uncle that like sort of like, that you have all these really fond memories of, but when he starts talking about this stuff, it's just like, that's stupid. Like give him that book, right? I think it's those kind of people that I would focus on.
I wonder if Dr. Kennedy, to give you the last word, if that dovetails with your 60-second idea to change the world, but why don't you give us that idea and then I will wrap it up. You get the last word, sir.
Well, I think we live in a world of all sorts of inequality, of course, racial and class and gender and ethnic and national, and obviously sexuality, and I wish that we as human beings were able to equate difference and recognize that these inequities are the result of oppressive structures, of bad laws and policies, as opposed to continuing to believe the myth that there's something wrong with that group on the lower end of those disparities, and almost sort of blaming the victims. I mean, if we were as human beings to really embrace our differences and really equate across difference, and really say if there's inequality, it's because there's something bad about our structures as opposed to our peoples, I believe we'd be able to really revolutionize our world.
The book is called Stamped from the Beginning, A Graphic History of Racist Ideas in America. Professors Ibram X. Kendi and Joel Christian Gill, both of Boston University. Gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Encourage everybody to pick up a copy of Stamped at the Beginning at your local bookstore. And this is just one of the many programs that come from the Commonwealth Club. If you'd like to watch more, or if you'd like to support the club's efforts in making both in-person and virtual programming, you can visit them online at commonwealthclub.org/events. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you so much for making time.